You are all familiar with Virginia Woolf's polemic delivered here. She might have been anticipating, even caricaturing Saul Bellow. She said, probably in the same paper that Pam's just quoted, speaking crudely, football and sport are important. The worship of fashion, the buying of clothes, trivial. And these values are inevitably transferred from life to fiction. This is an important book, the critic assumes, because it deals with war, or Africa, we might say. This is an insignificant book, because it deals with the feelings of a woman in a drawing room. A year later, she returned to the theme in Women in Fiction. The values of a woman are not the values of a man. A woman has to make serious what appears insignificant to a man and trivial what is to him important. In a word, men and women have different values. And thank heavens at Newnham, where the question of whether or not to admit men is endlessly discussed, we do not have to rehearse the arguments about whether men and women write differently. They do. You're meant to laugh at that point. I believe they do. We'll be discussing it afterwards. Oh, and by the way, I'm absolutely delighted that there are some men in the audience. And among Persephone readers, 20% are men. So that might mean that in the audience, there are 1 in 5, but actually I think it's fewer. But nevertheless, when someone like me makes these slightly anti-men remarks, you have to take them in the spirit in which they are meant, which is good-humoured and kindly. But polemic is no good unless it's polemical, because otherwise it's just dull. So just thought I'd say that to you men. So what we should focus on now is this question of women writers and success. Did they manage to write? Did they get published? Did they stay in print? Are they in the canon? Well, the answer is that there have been far more women writers than is generally acknowledged, because to a much greater extent than men, they fell out of view, fell out of print, fell out of the canon. For all kinds of reasons, as Germaine Greer put it in 1974, women enjoyed dazzling literary prestige during their own lifetime, only to vanish without trace from the records of posterity. For women, in fact, account for a huge proportion of the body of English writing over 300 years, and some have earned their livings by being writers. In other words, far more people are women than we generally accept. The writers was the only profession open to women, apart from being governesses and later teachers. Lorna Sage wrote in the 1999 Cambridge Guide to Women's Writing in English, literature became a suitable profession for a woman during the 18th and 19th centuries, when a father or a husband died, leaving no provision, when business ventures failed or extravagance undermined the family finances. Then decent women were allowed themselves to write for a living. And both Germaine and Janet Todd have demonstrated how many women poets and novelists there were in the 17th and 18th centuries. They have rediscovered scores of women who wrote, whether for money and therefore they can be called professionals, or whether for themselves and therefore they are deemed amateurs. And after the 1840s, as Catherine Tillotson revealed in her famous book, Novels of the 1840s, the job of the novelist definitely became a recognised profession, although there were, of course, still grave difficulties for early women writers who often published anonymously or used male pseudonyms. The First World War was the turning point. The death of many potential writers in France left women writers with a poignant sense of carrying on a literary tradition, or having to carry on the literary tradition, because people always say to me, why were there so many women writers between the wars? And one of the reasons is the death of the potential writers in the First World War. I mean, of course, there are lots of other reasons, but that isn't one. And it's ironic that the women began to write after the First World War, even though that tradition had excluded them in so many ways. So in the third decade of the 20th century, in the 20s, a surprisingly large number of young women determined to become writers. Because I work round the corner from Doughty Street, which Claire mentioned yesterday, coincidentally, in her, because of course that's where Dickens lived, I find it especially touching that in 1921, Vera Brittain and Winifred Hopbury simply took it for granted that they could leave Somerville and go to Bloomsbury, rent an attic flat, and settle down to writing novels. And they did so most successfully, as we all know. I wrote in my book about women writers in the early 80s, the years between the wars were the heyday of fiction written by women. Novel writing was finally a respectable occupation, and no longer could people like Mrs. Honeychurch in Forster's Room with a View abandon every topic to inveigh against those women who, instead of minding their houses and their children, seek notoriety through print. I love the word notoriety. It's the idea that women who struggle to write are doing it to get notoriety. In a word, middle-class women now had time, warmth, freedom from drudgery, an intelligence unsullied by the relentless and wearing monotony of housework. They had time to write, and this was a quite new thing. In order to move on quickly to a discussion, I have of course skipped over the 18th and the 19th century, where, as Janet has showed us, there were so many women writers, and the 19th century you can all point to them, but that's just to get your brains stimulated. So, the nub, why are a small number of women writers remembered and given a comfortable, settled place in the great tradition, while the majority suffer Evie Thompson's enormous condescension of posterity? Why was Jane Austen forgotten until her nephew's memoir of her in the 1870s started to revive her reputation? And why did she have to wait for Lord David Cecil in the period between the wars to put her firmly in the canon? Well, not Saul Bellow's canon. Why was it, as Elaine Showalter first pointed out in 1971, the very year of the infamous Mrs. Palfrey Booker, or non-Booker for Elizabeth, why was it that the proportion of female to male writers then taught to college students was a mere 1 in 12? 1 in 12, think about it. This is where I have to try and not get a slightly bitter tone in my voice, because when I was at Cambridge 10 years before, 8 years before, I could never really understand why I wasn't interested in the work that I was meant to be doing. It took me 2 decades before I realised that I wasn't interested, because the proportion of male to female writers was probably 14 male writers to 1 woman then, probably 12 as an improvement from the early 60s to the early 70s. I don't know why we all took it for granted, why we didn't rebel, why we didn't do anything about it, but somehow we were very docile and we didn't, and we sort of internalised it and thought it was us. We didn't. It's really quite interesting and mysterious, room for another MA. So why did the American writer Tilly Olson have to write a whole book, Silences, in 1980, about the demoralising effect on young women at college who have endlessly to read texts written by men, about men, in a language evolved by men, about male concepts of achievement? Answer came there none. Speaking personally again, it was in the early 1970s that, as I wrote 10 years later in A Very Great Profession, I called on my former supervisor at Newnham, the Joan Bennett, whom Claire mentioned last night, whom I loved, and funnily enough, her granddaughter Sarah is one of my closest friends now. But I called on Joan Bennett. I was then 28. And I told her that I was proposing to write a book about women novelists during the 1920s and 30s. This dear, white-haired, unashamedly intellectual Don was almost too appalled to speak. I remember it. It was down there it's one of those lovely houses in Newnham Walk, a sort of Art Deco house. I remember being in her sitting room, her study. Her only comfort was that I might continue some of the work pioneered by Queenie Leavis 40 years earlier. From her point of view, there were no 20th century women writers worthy of critical attention, with the obvious exception of Virginia Woolf, and the possible exceptions of Rosamond Lehman and Elizabeth Bowen. And may I say, Virginia Woolf, if we're now talking 1970s, had only just begun her revival. And when I was growing up, my sister, who's in the audience, and I lived next door to Beatrice Mayer, who was a sort of Bloomsbury, hanger-on's a really horrible word, but anyway, she knew all the Bloomsbury people. And in the 1950s, when we knew her, nobody read Virginia Woolf. I'm just telling you that in case you think that A Room of One's Own has always been an important text. It has not. It really didn't start till the 70s.